Everyone knows that Neanderthals ate meat, right? They were big, strong, and hairy, so they must have had a diet consisting only of animal protein, perhaps mammoth steaks cooked over an open fire. Well, not quite. We now know that Neanderthals were more like us than we thought, and that means they probably had a taste for sweets too. What else did our extinct relatives eat? And are there any secrets to their diet that could help us today? Neanderthals may have preferred meat, but evidence shows that they also enjoyed veggies, nuts, and fruit. In fact, new research suggests that Neanderthals may have favored fruit as much as or even more than meat. First of all, why do we think Neanderthals preferred meat? Why can't they just have eaten plants? After all, humans didn't evolve in a world without meat. We evolved in a world full of delicious wild game, but that doesn't mean everyone was out hunting woolly mammoths with spears. Plants were still a large part of the human diet, long before we invented agriculture and domesticated animals. Early humans lived during the Stone Age, which lasted from about 3.4 million years ago until about 3300 BCE. The Stone Age is divided into three periods: the Paleolithic, or Old Stone Age, the Mesolithic, or Middle Stone Age, and the Neolithic, or New Stone Age. The biggest difference between these periods is how people got their food. For most of the Stone Age, humans relied on foraging and collecting wild foods, a method sometimes called hunting and gathering. Humans traveled to seasonal food sources and lived off the land, eating plants and small animals, and occasionally hunting larger prey. The idea that only meat-eating carnivores could survive in the Stone Age comes from a theory called the savanna hypothesis. This theory claims that early humans evolved in a world of open grasslands, and that's why they hunted large African mammals like buffalo and antelope. But if you look at what scientists have actually found, there's no proof that either early humans or Neanderthals only ate meat. For example, some of the oldest plant remains ever found were discovered in a Neanderthal campsite in northern Iraq. The site, called Shubaika II, was occupied around 46,000 years ago. Among the many layers of artifacts, archaeologists found pollen, seeds, and fruit pits. They identified charred grains of wheat, barley, lentils, peas, grape seeds, and pistachio shells. It looks like the Neanderthals who lived here enjoyed a picnic lunch of roasted fruit, nuts, and vegetables. So where did the carnivore idea come from? One reason could be the famous cave paintings that depict herds of animals but very few people. The paintings show bison, reindeer, horses, and other large mammals. Some also show humans hunting those animals. But don't forget that somebody had to document these animals in order for them to end up painted on a cave wall. And when they lived in areas where large mammals roamed, that made sense. But the paintings aren't proof that they only ate meat. Even though they may have hunted large animals, researchers have found no evidence that Neanderthals preferred meat over plants. Instead, they may have chosen plants based on availability, nutrition, and ease of harvest. There is also evidence that Neanderthals ate berries and edible plants, and one of the main reasons they probably didn't starve to death is because they stored food. But if Neanderthals were vegetarians, why did they go extinct and we didn't? Well, one reason could be that Neanderthals didn't choose quality over quantity when it came to storing food. In 2019, researchers found traces of food remains in 38 shell middens or trash piles left behind by Neanderthals in Belgium. Shell middens are great places to learn about ancient diets because people tended to throw away bones and shells after eating soft tissues. Scientists analyzed the samples using zooarchaeology and archaeobotany, the study of animal and plant remains respectively. In total, the researchers identified 156,742 fragments from 565 different species. Most of them were mollusks, but they also found fish, birds, mammals, and more. Overall, their findings suggested that Neanderthals primarily ate mollusks instead of more nutritious foods like meat, and this choice eventually led to their demise. Their constant consumption of mollusks didn't provide enough calories or nutrients to keep their bodies healthy, especially during times of scarcity. Compare this to modern humans who didn't store their food in neat piles. Instead, we hid our stash in secret places, and maybe that's what helped us survive. Of course, this is speculation. We have no written records to tell us what prehistoric humans thought. so we have to infer their behavior from their actions and material remains. But modern humans weren't the only ones who cached food. Researchers recently reported the discovery of a Neanderthal food cache hidden in a cave in southern Siberia. The cache contained dozens of pieces of dried meat, fish and horse meat, along with several stone tools. The cache was at least 2,000 years old, and possibly 4,000. To put that in perspective, modern humans began caching food about 7,000 years ago, only 1,000 years before the Neanderthal stash. The fact that Neanderthals cached food implies that they understood the concept of saving food for future consumption. They didn't just prefer meat, they planned ahead. However, one advantage modern humans had was the ability to cultivate plants and raise animals. With farming, humans could produce their own food instead of relying on what nature provided. This practice led to a sedentary lifestyle, meaning that people stayed in one place instead of constantly moving to find food. Sedentary lifestyles allowed people to establish villages and eventually cities, which led to the formation of civilizations. And while humans spread across the globe, Neanderthals were mostly limited to Europe and parts of Asia. By 4,000 years ago, most Neanderthal populations went extinct. But that raises another question. If Neanderthals were smart enough to hunt large mammals, make tools and cache food, why did they go extinct? One popular theory is that Neanderthals lacked certain traits that allowed modern humans to adapt to different environments and develop new technologies. This includes symbolic thinking, sophisticated language abilities, and the capacity for social learning. The theory goes that modern humans were better at solving problems and adapting to change, so they were able to replace the Neanderthals, but unfortunately, the archaeological record has thrown us a curveball. Experts have struggled to find physical evidence of these traits. There's no clear difference between Neanderthal artifacts and ours, and we haven't found anything that proves they couldn't create symbols, speak or learn from each other. Even their brains were about the same size as ours. On top of that, DNA evidence suggests that modern humans interbred with Neanderthals. So, if they were so much better than us, why did they need us? Maybe they didn't need us, maybe they simply coexisted with us and had the same capabilities. The only thing that set us apart was our luck. Modern humans could have simply been in the right place at the right time when the conditions were ripe for domesticating animals and plants. And then we used those resources to build civilizations and spread across the globe. Maybe we're the lucky ones. Who knows? We may never know exactly what Neanderthals ate, but we do know they enjoyed a variety of foods, including fruit, nuts, and vegetables. Not only does that make them more like us than we thought, it also means they may have suffered from the same health problems we face today, like obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. A 2015 study published in the Journal of Nature, Ecology and Evolution used stable isotopes to determine the diets of Neanderthals and modern humans who lived in what is now Israel between 12,000 and 13,000 years ago. They analyzed the isotopes of carbon and nitrogen in 17 individuals. Carbon-13 is an isotope of carbon that plants take up through photosynthesis. When animals eat the plants, they incorporate the carbon-13 into their tissue. Meanwhile, nitrogen-15 is taken up by plants and microbes, and then animals incorporate it when they eat the plants or microbes. By analyzing the ratios of carbon and nitrogen isotopes in their bones, the researchers learned that both Neanderthals and modern humans ate lots of plants and meat. Neanderthals seem to rely more on C4 plants, which include crops like corn and sugarcane. But the really surprising result was that Neanderthals had higher levels of nitrogen compared to modern humans. That means they consumed more meat than we did. And since meat contains more nitrogen than plants, scientists hypothesized that Neanderthals may have experienced higher rates of obesity and cardiovascular disease than modern humans. Unfortunately, the sample size was small, so more research is needed. But this study highlights how similar Neanderthals were to us. They faced the same health concerns, and maybe they enjoyed the same snacks too. So the next time someone tells you that Neanderthals only ate meat, remember they probably ate fruit too. Thanks for watching this episode. Subscribe if you haven't already, and if you have a little Neanderthal in you, share this video with your favorite carnivore. You probably learned in school that Neanderthals were big dumb cavemen who walked on two legs. used rudimentary tools and hunted woolly mammoths for food. It's easy to think of them as not too different from modern humans, but their brains were 25% smaller than ours. So how smart were they really, and did they have a taste for human flesh? Welcome to Paleo Logic. When it comes to what Neanderthals ate, we mostly get our information from what's left behind. After all, there's no such thing as a Neanderthal cookbook. What archaeologists unearth gives us a better idea of whether they were plant-based vegans or carnivorous meat eaters. Unfortunately, the evidence doesn't give us an easy answer. For most of the 19th century, archaeologists found very few Neanderthal bones. Some early discoveries included the thigh bone of a young female in France in 1856, then the skull of an adult male in Belgium in 1886. By 1908, when the British archaeologist and anthropologist Arthur Keith had been studying the subject for over 30 years, he still only knew of about 40 Neanderthal skeletons. But this didn't stop him from making bold proclamations. In 1907, Keith published a paper titled The Diet of the Neanderthal Man, in which he claimed that because of their massive brow ridges and large jaws, Neanderthals must have been carnivorous. In 1913 he wrote, "They must have lived by hunting, as is evidenced by the structure of their jaws and teeth. They are essentially carnivorous, and I believe that they lived mainly on meat." Keith was essentially arguing that since they looked kind of scary, they must have been scary. He imagined them as ferocious predators living in caves and feeding on the flesh of animals they'd caught. But the problem with this argument is that we now know that brain size isn't directly related to intelligence. Modern scientific thinking suggests that Neanderthals actually had brains that were wired differently than ours. They had brains with more connections between different regions, which made their cognitive processing more parallel and less sequential than ours. This could mean that they might have been able to solve problems in more innovative ways than modern humans could. But given that they went extinct around 40,000 years ago, we don't really know. What's more, some scientists argue that the physical features Keith used to argue for carnivory are actually consistent with a largely plant-based diet. Their strong jaws would have been good for grinding tough plants, while their large bodies might have helped them conserve energy when foraging. In fact, Keith himself acknowledged that while the jaw was suited for carnivory, the teeth were not. They were better suited for grinding, not tearing, so they weren't exactly wolf-like. The shape of their teeth suggests they ate something like modern humans do. Humans in different cultures eat vastly different foods, from crunchy vegetables to soft fruits, and have developed teeth to suit their diets. So Keith was right, that their teeth aren't the best evidence of what they ate. And what they ate wasn't just about the shape of their mouths and teeth, it was also about the environment they lived in, the other species they shared it with, and the technology they used to hunt and gather. The picture that emerges is one of a species that was pretty resourceful, capable of adapting to environments across Europe during the Ice Age, from cold, dry, mountainous regions to coastal areas with milder climates. Analysis of ancient DNA has shown that Neanderthals interbred with Homo sapiens as early as 45,000 years ago in what is now Spain. And before that, as far back as 130,000 years ago, evidence shows that they lived alongside humans in southern Siberia, suggesting that they overlapped with humans for tens of thousands of years. Since humans today eat everything from seals in the Arctic to termites in Africa, it's reasonable to assume that Neanderthals, who lived among us and bred with us, had a varied diet. So if they were neither hyper-aggressive carnivores nor gentle herbivores, what did they eat? One way of finding out is to study stable isotopes, which is a method used to figure out the proportion of meat in a person's diet when they were alive. Scientists compare the ratio of carbon isotopes in a person's remains, specifically the collagen in bone. If their diet consisted of plants, the collagen will have a lower ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 atoms. If they ate lots of meat, the ratio will be higher. One study published in 2011 analyzed 5 Neanderthal skeletons from the Czech Republic who lived between 43,000 and 39,000 years ago. 3 of the 5 individuals had higher levels of carbon-13 than the other 2, indicating that they ate more meat than plants. Researchers suggested that the difference might have been due to the sex and age of the individuals, and that males actively hunted and ate more meat than females and children. But more research is needed to explore this further. Other studies have come to similar conclusions. A 2015 paper argued that Neanderthals at the Vindija cave in Croatia were more reliant on animal proteins than modern humans in the same area. The researchers said that the differences in the carbon isotope ratios between Neanderthals and modern humans suggest that Neanderthals consumed more meat and dairy than modern humans, but that plant food still made up more than half of their diet. These findings are backed up by archaeological evidence. Remains of animals have been found near many Neanderthal sites. In some cases, they appear to have butchered the animals where they got them, while in others, it looks like they transported the meat back to their camp. For example, at the site of El Sidrón in Spain, where several Neanderthals died, there was evidence of 17 deer, including butchered bones, stone tools, and animal skin. While these finds suggest that Neanderthals regularly ate meat, there's little evidence that they were exclusively carnivorous, let alone that they hunted large animals like woolly mammoths. Many of the animals whose bones were found alongside Neanderthals are small, such as birds, rabbits, and wild dogs. And while some of the sites contain the remains of larger animals, including reindeer and bison, these seem to have been butchered during the summer, while the Neanderthals were likely hibernating during the winter. Take the site of Pesterla Cave in Romania, for instance. Archaeologists have found Neanderthal bones and stone tools here, as well as animal bones from deer, bison, and wild cattle. But they've also found seeds from plants that grow in open fields, not forests, suggesting that Neanderthals were active in the area outside of winter. It appears that Neanderthals were skilled hunters, but rather than chasing herds of mammoths, they relied on smaller game and supplemented their diet with berries, nuts, seeds, and plants. Basically, they were generalists who were happy to eat pretty much anything they could catch or pick. Now you might be wondering, if they ate plants, did they cultivate them? The answer is almost certainly no. Unlike humans, Neanderthals never domesticated any plants or animals, and they didn't leave behind any evidence of agriculture. Even the idea that they were capable of abstract thought is hotly debated. While some experts point to their sophisticated tool use as evidence of complex thought, others say that even if Neanderthals had the capacity for abstract thought, they didn't necessarily develop the same kind of symbolic language that modern humans did. All of this is to say that despite living alongside humans for tens of thousands of years, there's very little evidence that Neanderthals had much contact with each other. This brings us back to the question of cannibalism. Did Neanderthals eat people? Given their supposedly brutish nature, you might think the answer is yes, of course. But there's no archaeological evidence of Neanderthal cannibalism. Keith argued for cannibalism as early as 1907, claiming that their front teeth would have been useful for cutting up human flesh. But given that he also believed they were ferocious carnivores, this isn't exactly surprising. Other anthropologists quickly challenged his claims, pointing out that the front teeth would have been terrible for cutting and that there was no archaeological evidence for cannibalism. Since then, discoveries have done little to change that conclusion. In 2003, a study of a Neanderthal skeleton found cut marks consistent with defleshing. But the team couldn't say whether another Neanderthal had done the cutting or whether it was a member of another species. And in 2014, researchers came to the conclusion that Neanderthal cannibalism was more likely to have been practiced during times of famine. In other words, the evidence suggests that Neanderthals were neither more nor less likely to eat people than our species. Given that there's no hard evidence that they preferred human flesh, maybe we should put those rumors to rest and remember that they were complex, intelligent beings who lived alongside us for tens of thousands of years. The famous British naturalist Sir David Attenborough has narrated nature docs for decades, including those in the popular Planet Earth series. But did you know that he's also narrated a documentary about the Neanderthals? In it, he says something really interesting about their diet. It turns out Neanderthals were surprisingly vegan. Well, not exactly. What Attenborough meant was that even though Neanderthals were primarily meat-eaters, they were more flexible with their eating preferences than we previously thought. In fact, an analysis of their dental structure suggests they weren't averse to veggies and fruit. This might have been an advantage for them, as plants could have provided crucial nutrients that were otherwise lacking in their meals. So what evidence do we have for this surprising claim? And how did scientists draw conclusions about Neanderthal diets in the first place? Let's get into it. We've learned a lot about Neanderthals over the years. They lived in Europe and parts of Asia, from around 400,000 to 45,000 years ago. They made tools, buried their dead, and lived in social groups just like us. We've also learned a lot about what they ate through the study of their fossilized poop, also called coprolites. The scientific name for that is endofeces. No, we won't be calling them that from here on out. When analyzing the contents of fossilized feces, scientists are on the hunt for plant and animal remains, such as seeds, spores, pollen, or bones. These remains can reveal things like what a person ate, how food was prepared, and even signs of certain diseases. In the case of Neanderthals, this is our best source of dietary information, because unfortunately there aren't many well-preserved Neanderthal stomachs lying around for us to study. One of the most famous Neanderthal coprolites is this one nicknamed Ty. Ty was discovered in 1997 at the Neanderthal site of El Castillo in Spain. It's notable because it contains the oldest DNA ever recovered at the time. Scientists published a paper on Ty's DNA and its potential implications for understanding ancient diets in 2014. You see, the researchers wanted to know whether the Neanderthals who lived in this area ate only meat, or if they also regularly consumed plants. To find out, they extracted DNA from Ty and searched for marker genes that are typically found only in animals or only in plants. Since Neanderthals had the genetic blueprint to digest meat, but not plants, any plant DNA found in the coprolite would have come from undigested plant matter, meaning that these plants were part of their diet. They found a total of 5 animal and 13 plant DNA sequences in the sample. This suggested that this particular Neanderthal's last meal consisted of hazelnuts, mushrooms, wild barley grains, and the remains of a small mammal. But this wasn't enough evidence to make any broad claims about Neanderthal diets. After all, this was just one individual from a single site. However, the team did notice something strange. Even though the DNA results suggested that this person ate some nuts, there was no phytoliths in the sample. Phytolith is the name for tiny mineral structures formed inside plants. They can survive digestion and often preserve in coprolites, serving as direct evidence of plant consumption. This particular coprolite contained plenty of fecal bacteria, but none of the expected phytolith. The team suggested that maybe the Neanderthals didn't digest their food very thoroughly, or maybe their ancestors had descended from a primate species that ate more plants than their predecessors did. But today, scientists have trouble agreeing on either of these explanations. Still, the search for phytoliths in other coprolites has generally failed to turn up any evidence that Neanderthals regularly ate plants. However, the study of dental structure may provide another way of getting at their diet. Teeth tell us what someone ate by looking at their morphology, or the size and shape of their mouth and teeth. Specifically, scientists focus on the morphology of the teeth's chewing surface, called the occlusal surface. You see, the shape of the occlusal surface is adapted to the type of food a creature eats. Compared to modern humans, Neanderthals had large, strongly built bodies. They had prominent brow ridges, a low, long skull, and a large nose. Their teeth were larger too, with thicker enamel and shorter, flatter crowns. These features suggest that Neanderthals used their teeth to tear into flesh, and that they ground their food into small pieces using their broad, flat teeth. But why don't scientists think that Neanderthals were exclusively carnivorous? For starters, other predatory mammals that have similar tooth shapes to Neanderthals, such as hyenas and wolves, have serrated teeth. This helps them slice through flesh. Neanderthal teeth, however, were smooth, which means that they likely used a different strategy for cutting their food. The idea is that Neanderthals sliced meat by pulling and tearing chunks off of their prey rather than slicing through it with their teeth. Another piece of evidence against an exclusive carnivorous diet comes from studying microwear texture analysis, or muta. Scientists can determine what an ancient person ate by examining thin sections of their teeth under a microscope. Each tooth is assigned a number between 1 and 6 based on the complexity of its scratches and grooves. 1 indicates a mostly soft diet. As the number goes up, the scratches become more complex, suggesting a diet of tougher, more abrasive foods. Neanderthal teeth generally fall between 4 and 6, suggesting that they crunched and ground their food during the day. Now, you might be thinking that a number between 4 and 6 does not leave much room for softer foods like fruits and veggies. But remember, their teeth were built for slicing meat. Having softer foods occasionally wouldn't change the texture much. Plus, scientists have observed that finely chopped plants produce different wear patterns than coarsely chopped plants. So even though Neanderthal teeth are generally consistent with a carnivorous diet, they aren't completely incompatible with a diet that includes lots of plants. Scientists think that Neanderthals likely preferred meat and hunted animals for food. However, they probably supplemented their diet with whatever plants were available. This could have been advantageous for them, since plants could have provided important nutrients that were lacking in their meat-heavy meals. The two groups likely benefited from each other. Plants would have helped supplement the Neanderthals' diets, and the Neanderthals would have helped disperse the plant's seeds through their poop. In fact, some studies suggest that Neanderthals preferentially shat by the side of plant-rich areas like river valleys. Dispersing seeds this way would have been especially beneficial for plants that need disturbance or fire to germinate. Some scientists even suggest that Neanderthals may have deliberately planted some of the seeds they collected. This hypothesis is based on the observation that the seeds they dispersed were often cracked or split, which may have been a deliberate effort to ensure the seeds sprouted. If this is true, it would suggest that Neanderthals understood the link between seed dispersal and plant growth, a concept that most animals don't grasp. And this isn't the only evidence that Neanderthals had a nuanced understanding of plants. They also used certain plants for medicinal purposes. For example, they used the extracts of certain plants to treat stomach aches, wounds, rheumatism, and possibly even insect bites. Neanderthals even seem to have specialized knowledge of local plants and knew which ones to avoid. For example, they avoided eating the highly poisonous water hemlock but still used it medicinally. Given their intimate knowledge of plants, it seems unlikely that Neanderthals would ignore the nutritional benefits of veggies and fruit. So while we don't have a ton of evidence for the exact composition of their meals, scientists have good reason to believe that Neanderthals were less picky eaters than their reputation might suggest. Maybe they weren't as averse to plants as we previously thought. Perhaps they embraced a flexitarian diet long before the term was invented. That's certainly something worth chewing on.